Okay, so we're back over here in Visual Studio 2017, and we're going to check out how easy it is to get Application Insights active for developers. And I know you mentioned it before, but this is something as a developer, Application Insights might get installed or configured, might get selected when I create a new solution. And I have to admit, in the beginning, I used to uncheck it, or I would try and get rid of it, and I thought, you know, this is just some extra thing that I don't need. That was before I understood what Application Insights has done. Now I always enable Application Insights for anything that I'm going to keep around for any length of time, because it's just absolutely phenomenal. So there's a couple of things we want to look at here. Number one is I want to call out this NuGet package dependency that we have. First thing that we want to do is add the NuGet package. So if we were to search for Application Insights, you'll see that this is going to show up here. We want the one that is core. Notice how this says Microsoft.ApplicationInsights or ApplicationInsights.web. You can try and select these, but because it's going to enforce the compliance for cross-browser compatibility, it's going to tell you that it doesn't work. The one that we have is Microsoft.ApplicationInsights.ASP.NET, or excuse me, ASP.NET Core. And you'll notice how this is kind of a theme here. If you take a look at these dependencies here, how they've all got .ASP.NET Core associated with the NuGet package name. So you might do this, you might think, okay, now I've got the dependency in here, but you know, how do I get my telemetry being surfaced up, added to Azure Portal? And so the developers understand what's happening. This data is being aggregated, analyzed, sent up to Azure. Okay, there's going to be some database or storage element up in Azure that this data is going to be sent to. Now some developers might say, well, I don't really want this up in Azure. Well, you want it to be somewhere. The beauty of having it in Azure is you can use this data and connect it to a whole bunch of other Azure services while you're up there. So let's go back to that startup.css and add the code to get Application Insights active. So if we go down here to configure, we'll see that this is just a bunch of stuff that gets set in by default. Remember that we said we want to use this middleware, static files, MVC. Let's go ahead and add in these two pieces for Application Insights. And I'm going to stick this one up top. This is just a personal preference I have here. We have two lines of code for middleware for Application Insights. We have use Application Insights request telemetry, and this is going to say I want everything related to the request to be monitored with the telemetry namespace. And then we're also going to add, and this is optional, but I like it, the Application Insights exception telemetry. I actually stick this down here because I want this exception handler to be registered first. So we're going to say don't just monitor the request, but I want all of that exception stuff to come over as well. And then if you're in development, there's a third thing that I like to do. I like to see if this is a development environment. So this is a cool thing. We can actually label these development, staging, production. I don't have to put in a whole bunch of is debug. I don't have to put in all of this stuff like this. I can just say if this is in development, do this. Well, this is a little trick that you can do when it's creating your hosting environment using the builder. You can say add Application Insights settings developer mode equals true, and what this is going to do here is it's going to get rid of the delay. So by default there's going to be a few seconds or a few minutes delay for that telemetry to be available up in the Azure portal to analyze. If you add this line of code, then it's going to be available. But basically going to push it right away so that you can take a look at it right away. And then I mentioned that we have this concept of custom events as well. So let's go out here and I'm just going to create this little helper here that I'm calling telemetry helper, and it's going to add an event or add a metric, and it's just going to call the Application Insights telemetry client. And I don't need to write this helper here. This just makes it easy for me to just call this add event or add metric anywhere in my code. So for example, in this scenario, we're going to let people upload photos. So when they upload photos, we may want to add a custom event that says that a file was added. Or we're going to add authentication through Microsoft Graph. We may want to add an event that says this user was authenticated. This gives us the ability to track exactly what people are doing. Or if we're trying to debug a scenario and we don't know what's going to happen, we can add one of these custom events in there as well. So we've added support for custom telemetry. We've added the ability to track the request and exception data through application insights on the server side. But you may want to track some of the stuff that's happening on the client side as well, some of the JavaScript errors or other things like that. So if we were to go into our layouts view, this is common to have an underscore layouts in your shared for MVC, you'll notice at the bottom I've got this JavaScript line for App Insights there as well. So if we add this line, it's going to track all of that great stuff that's happening on the client. Now, if you're wondering, how do I add this line of code in here? This is available in the documentation. It's also available from the Azure portal. When you go to enable Application Insights in the Azure portal, it'll actually let you copy and paste this line, and you can just paste this code in there. So that's all great, but let's go in and take a look at what gets output by Application Insights when we run the app. So let's load this app up. We'll just load in Microsoft Edge here. We'll load up Tagger. And you'll notice that we've got this Application Insights that opens up. Let's go right to Search Telemetry. Now, just for fun, I'm going to press the search bar and you might panic. Developers are going to say, oh my gosh, it doesn't have any telemetry. Some people spend quite a bit of time on this wondering where all their telemetry went. Here's a hint. This may disconnect from the Azure portal every time you run it. This is something that is going to be resolved in the final release of Visual Studio 2017, but may not be resolved for you in RC. So if you just click on this little configure icon, you can say that you want to pull up a resource from Azure. I'm going to select my Microsoft account. And I'm going to pick the Application Insight resource that's already available for Tagger out there, and I'm going to connect to it. Now watch what happens when I go to search for telemetry.
So it's actually pulling this down from the data store in Azure right now,
exactly. Right? So there we go. There we've got all the telemetry for this app. And we're not going to dig into it heavily here, Jeff, but I want you to take a look at some of this, just all this stuff that's available. I mean, we've got everything. We've got IP addresses, we've got countries, we've got every page that was loaded, we've got everything that you can imagine used to be in the IIS logs. Mm-hmm. But now we have a whole bunch more. We even have our custom events that we can filter by. So if I were just to take that off and show me just custom events, and I'll say everything that's been in the last 3 days.
Some of this telemetry is going to make your marketing department very happy, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the cool things about this. So a developer may not even want to use this, but all of this is available to decision makers, right? Marketing directors. So here's an example of where I'm using this user authenticated file added. Now I can actually go through and watch how many people are using the features, right? Are people even uploading photos, or even people even authenticating? This gives us the ability to really do a kind of a due diligence on the features of our app. You know, what do people love? What do people hate? Where are people having problems with this? And as you mentioned, this is all available in the Azure portal. Let's just flip over to the Azure portal and take a look at that real quick. So I've got this Application Insights that we just pointed to in Visual Studio. Let me pull that up in the Azure portal and take a look at that. So if you're used to working in the Azure portal, this should look fairly familiar to you. I've got all this data that's loaded up here. I'm just going to click around and show some of this stuff. Here's all of this content based on server response. Here's all this content based on page view. People are going to see this. They're going to say, yeah, we've got these little charts, these little graphs. Yeah, great. Well, let's go a little deeper than that. One direction I like to go is through this app map, the application map that I talked about in the slide deck. Let's just say, let's look at some of this stuff that's happening on the server with this. So in this history, based on my time range options, I've got 135 requests. If I just click right here, this is going to open up right away in Analytics. And I'm not going to do a ton in here because, again, this Application Insights could be an entire hour session. But watch what it did for me. Notice how it wrote this query in the Analyzer query language for me. See that output just by me clicking that button? And I could have changed that to whatever I wanted, and it's outputting it in this nice chart. I could say, well, show me that in a pie chart, right? And so now we've got this breakdown. The point that I want to make here is as that data is being, as that telemetry is being aggregated real time, all of that information is up there available in Application Insights for people to make decisions. And again, we're talking not just about developers, we're talking about operations guys, we're talking about administrators, we're talking about security people, we're talking about marketing directors. You know, every kind of department now has this information that they can draw on. And one of the cool things that we'll maybe look at in a later session is we can bring all of this stuff right into Power BI. So I'm not going to do it here. It's pretty cool, but I can just actually say export Power BI query, and it's going to give me something I can just paste into Power BI. And so that we could actually have an entire dashboard in Power BI devoted just to our telemetry here. So it's pretty cool, easy to get going, and it's pretty cool, but super powerful. So now that we've walked through creating a .NET Core solution, an ASP.NET Core web application, and kind of looked at how that's structured and mostly how familiar most of it ought to be to developers, and then demonstrated how to add application insights, I just want to finish up with just some tips, tricks, and thoughts related to that. These are things that, as I've gone through this process for clients or for other customers, that I've sort of run into. And things that I think that'll be helpful for people, for developers when they're watching this. Number one, and I cannot stress this enough, is experiment with VS Code. I know you're creating web form apps. I know you're doing all this other stuff. I know your solutions are huge and you probably have, 100,000 users, but go and experiment with VS Code. This will really help you understand what's happening. Besides the fact that it's just fun. Also experiment with the empty templates. If you're like me, you're lazy and you want to say, I want everything to be created for me and I hardly ever use the blank template, just give me MVC template or the web API template. Go and experiment with the empty templates. Challenge yourself to make it an MVC application from an empty template or a web API application. This is how you really get to understand these pieces. So that you can say, oh, now when you run into an error, it's very much easier to say, I know what's going on because I know what's happening in there. And get used to the concept of middleware. It's great. This is great. I don't need anything, but if I want it, I say use for the middleware. And then if you really want to become a pro, get used to using analytics query language, and not just for application insights analytics. There's a lot of commonality between the query language there and the Power BI Advanced Query Editor and our services, which we're not going to cover in this session, but our services and some of that data science stuff you referred to earlier. And then start using the package management, especially for stuff that are client-side. I know you're used to sticking in Bootstrap and jQuery and all that just by copying and pasting stuff in and managing it that way. But get used to bringing them in through things like Bower, NPM. Bring them in that way through the command line. And that's the last one, is learn to love the command line again. I'm from the days where we had to use the command line for a bunch of stuff, and it went away. I've worked with developers who aren't so comfortable with the command line. PowerShell has helped, but there's a bunch of stuff you can do with just a command line. And it's just fun to do it that way sometimes. That'd be the last thing I'd say. Learn to love the command line because the power of the command line is coming back.
It is, and you can tell by the color of our hair, Scott, that we've both been around long enough to remember when we did everything on the command line. I couldn't agree more. And the great news is this is really just a start. We have lots more cool stuff to show as we build this application out, demonstrate the application and stuff like that. So let's take a break and come back in the next module.
All right, sounds great. See you soon.